Government has finally terminated the state of disaster 750 days after it was first implemented on the 15th of March. This follows threats of court action by several organizations and opposition parties who argued that the regulations had become redundant. One of those organizations is AfriForum, whose campaign officer for strategy and content, Reiner Duvenage, joins me now to talk more on the issue. Reiner, good evening. Good to have you with us tonight. Well, what does this really mean as far as your organization heading to court to stop government from extending the national state of disaster? It's now been lifted. There are particular limitations or restrictions that still remain in place, like the number on gatherings, the issue on the wearing of masks, etc., etc. But by and large, we are not in a lockdown as we speak right now.
Good evening, Thabo. Good evening to the viewers, and thanks for the opportunity to be on the show. Well, like you mentioned, the government announced that the state of disaster would be lifted, but we have to remember and to take into consideration that in the first place this would never have happened without AfriForum and other organizations actually taking legal action against the government, and I think the government knew that it had no leg to stand on and it simply needed to end the state of disaster. But this is purely a symbolic victory, because the government actually just after announcing the new regulations, they announced from 15 to 22 March, they announced far-reaching regulations and amendments to the National Health Act. And in accordance with these new regulations, the government will be able to, the temporary or supposedly temporary COVID-19 measures under the Disaster Management Act will actually be enacted permanently into legislation. This is a very, very dangerous abuse of power. And the ending of the state of disaster yesterday actually, doesn't really change much, because the government still has the measures in place temporarily for another month until the new Health Act regulations come into force. So this is something that we're not taking very lightly. We are definitely going to fight this battle, and we are against the new health regulations, and we're preparing our commentary on the health regulations as we speak, and we'll take this matter to the highest possible court.
All right, that's the next question I would have wanted to find out from you. How are you engaging with the process? Are you making submissions as far as the regulations or the new regulations are concerned? And what are your areas of concern particularly? For example, others have raised the question of government being able to say, well, if we test you and we find reason that you're showing signs, we can send you to quarantine.
Yeah, well, in the first place, we're preparing legal commentary, so that's the way the process works, and that will be submitted before the April 15 deadline. We also have a petition on our website, afriforum.co.za, and it's already been signed by 25,000 people, probably 30,000 by the end of the week, which just shows that we really have the public support in this matter. And, we have a lot of concerns, mainly, it actually is a repetition of some measures that were actually struck down in court. This is also something like forced quarantine, which was struck down in court, and this is actually present in the new regulations. It's also ultra vires, so in other words, it's outside the scope of what the legislation was actually thought to be or intended to be. So in this sense, the legislation, the Health Act, was never intended to have such far-reaching consequences, and it, in the third place, it infringes on bodily and physical integrity. So these health measures, or health regulations, are actually completely illegal and irrational, and that will be the basis of our legal arguments. And we are very, very confident that the government's new regulations are legally shaky.
Yeah. So what's the material effect then of your challenge? You want, for example, mandatory mask wearing to be lifted completely, that nobody should be made to wear a mask, whether indoor or outdoor or wherever.
We are the position that the state of disaster should be lifted. So COVID-19 was a tragic pandemic, but the government announced we are at 80% immunity level or rate, and there's no more reason for these far-reaching measures. It's given the government unbridled power, and as we've seen now with this new health regulations, the government is unwilling to relinquish this unbridled power it received during COVID-19. And so the state of disaster, when the government says it's lifting the state of disaster, it needs to actually do so and give the citizens their freedoms back that they're really craving and that they deserve.
Yeah. What do you make of the debate raised by the minister today to say there are still a number of unknowns? For example, what the fifth wave would be like, whether it would be more severe than Omicron or even more severe than the second or the third wave. There's still that issue to deal with, and therefore we need to keep certain protocols in place to prevent a complete collapse of our health system.
No, these are all hypotheticals. The thing is, the government itself is actually admitting that the state of disaster has to be lifted. There is no longer a disaster. And this just means that the government, in keeping these things in place, it's quite clear that the government is clinging on to power, desperately clinging on to power. And if the government actually wants to, if there's a massive disaster, again, nothing is stopping the government, if there are legitimate grounds, from declaring another state of disaster. But we cannot have these measures permanently enacted into law, which gives the government to just gives government the power to just actually enact these measures at a moment's notice. So we cannot have that at all. And this is what the powers that this would give the government, and it's simply not acceptable.
Yeah, and I suppose that's the same view you take on the gatherings limitation.
Yes, we are of the opinion that we've seen it across the world. People are returning to normal. The tragic pandemic is coming to an end. The government itself admitted that the majority of people the great majority of people have immunity, and there's no reason for these measures to stay in place. And now the government itself admitted it by lifting the state of disaster, but now it's keeping the measures in place. So it's completely an outrageous abuse of power. And the state of disaster needs to be, when the government says it's lifting the state of disaster, it actually has to do so, and not just slyly and actually temporarily try and enact these measures through a back door.